Welcome to Remarkable WRAM.
Inflection.
Oh right, okay.
Just the way. Just as Chris is a consultant, you can smell it. Sorry, Chris, that was just a cheap joke.
I'm going to take that as a compliment.
Really? Okay, Chris, you do that.
I'm flattered. I'm flattered. There's something in my eye. I mean,
no. You got to remember the consultant way is all very standard. It's like if you don't have a solution, there's money to be made continuing the problem.
Well, yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah. But let me take your watch and charge you to tell the time.
Oh, steady. Well, let's look. I mean, Richard, if you're comfortable, I know I pinged you something a bit late. I do apologise.
No, thank you. That's all I needed. I just needed 10 minutes. That's all I got, and that's all I needed. In fact, the longer you leave me with it, the more complex the answers, which is not what you wanted. So.
Oh, exactly. So, no, I think that what we're going to do is exactly as that agenda. We're rattling through. You do realise there's a quiz.
I saw that.
I know. Look, it is based around. Look, it's biased towards your interests and your life. So, unfortunately, it is a head-to-head against Andy.
Oh, good.
And Andy's.
I'm feeling good today, though.
Are you? I was going to be disparaging, but let's just let's ignore that. Glass is half full, okay? I think you got a chance.
Glass is too big for the fluid. That's how I'm looking at today.
Look, Richard's dosing up on drugs and all sorts. He's weak today. I can sense it. I
don't know what setup I've been. I smell down there is an ambush. So that's all I read. I didn't see quiz. I just said that's an ambush. It's a choke point there. I just don't like the look of.
No. Look, let's just say that Andy's record is not as good as he'd like it to be against our other guests. So.
Yeah. I played enough pool to see a shark. Come on.
Well, I don't know about a shark, more of a goldfish. If I'd continued to beat our guests, then I think the theme would be a rigged quiz, no matter how transparent the questions and answers are.
Let's get to it, guys.
Let's crack on.
Now I'm walking into this ambush quite comfortably.
I think the mental game's working here, Chris.
Yeah,
it's true. So look, let's introduce ourselves properly. So look, my name's Chris Mills, and together with my friend Andy Reid, we're here today and the hosts of Remarkable WRAM, Remarkable Wealth and Asset Management. So, and today, and we've got an ongoing series. So today we'll have more remarkable stories and initiatives from remarkable people working in WRAM and financial services. So, you well today, Andy? Looking forward?
I'm good. I'm very well. I'm feeling remarkable for the time of the day that we're recording this. And we're already in the pre-record banter. Richard and I are clearly aligned and excited about the conversation we're going to have with you in rewriting the rule book around wealth and asset management. So let our conversation commence.
Yeah, and I think, just to that point, this is about, we like having discussions and hearing people's stories. The train of the conversation, hopefully, is in evolving and enhancing wealth and asset management. Richard's been dipping in and out of that subject for a number of years. And I'm really excited to talk to him. So I think I should introduce him, don't you?
Yes, crack on.
So look, we're joined today by, and these are my words, Richard, the pioneering and thought-provoking Richard Crook. Richard studied a master's in computer systems engineering at Bristol. So he's a proper trained technologist. I warn you, Andy. He started his career as a developer, I think, in investment banking at UBS, before moving into program management and running a development team of probably scores of tricky and interesting and innovative folk. And he moved to RBS, becoming the head of emerging technology, where we actually first met, probably discussing blockchain, most likely at that time. But more recently, Richard founded Lab 577, combining his skills, I guess, in financial services and emerging technology. And specifically, from what I can tell around AI, blockchain and quantum computing, we can explore that later with you, Richard. honestly, I think you're one of the best communicators of complex tech ideas that I know. And I always learn something new and fascinating. And I'm excited to start. So how are you today, Richard?
I'm a little bit concerned with that introduction. Thank you. I'm very flattered, but now you've really set me up for the rest of this. Hopefully, I can meet those wonderful words.
No, I think it's entirely. Most of that was correct, wasn't it? Bristol engineering.
Yes, yeah. It was laded with factual factoids and a whole series of warming adjectives. If I
excellent, no, excellent. So look, we as we do with most of our guests, if it's okay, we're going to roll all the way back to the beginning, and just to start that story right at the start. And I think I'll ask you some very simple questions. As you know, why did you study computer science and engineering? What was the attraction? Apart from wanting to be a fireman, where did you go from there?
So I'm one of those generation that we were very fortunate. Malcolm Gladwell has now pointed out the kind of 10,000 hour that grew up with the ZX Spectrum, the BBC Micro, and just was soaked in it at a very early age, early teens. Was published on one of the pieces of software that I wrote in my mid-teens, and just loved anything to do with computers. Actually, the school curriculum at the time didn't really cover that, although I did have some remarkably good teachers. Mr. Widdowson, sadly departed now, is probably one that I would name in my background that both engaged me and directed me at that was very early age. But that then leads you to what are you going to do at university, which obviously steps you into what you're going to do once you get out. At university, I picked computer systems engineering, which was a mix of engineering maths, which effectively was AI, neural nets in those days. The silicon, doping silicon, so all the way down to the hardware, analog and physical. So you learn all about the deep of what actually makes a computer. And then, of course, the software, where we found that the software was the easiest part of the course. Well, I certainly did. So I skewed towards that as you were desperately trying to achieve the credits. My lecturers will probably not thank me for saying that. But once we then got to the end of the 4 years and you were wondering what to do, the investment banks came calling, where they took an entire generation of us. I don't think there were very few that of my course or of my generation of engineers that didn't end up in the investment banks or working for one of the consultants who then ended up working for the investment banks. And we spent 10, 15 years growing up, delivering tech where they were pretty much the best gig in town. They had the most money. They didn't care. As long as it created an edge and created profit, they wanted you to deploy it. And we were deployed in many different forms and factors to improve the financial system.
So did you want a Sinclair C5?
I think I did. I think everybody did. I think now when I look back, I definitely don't. With hindsight, I think that's probably one of the key differences. Is many of those things in the past, you probably look back fondly and go, "I wish I'd had one of those."
Yes.
Well, actually, this is one of those pieces of tech that I didn't have. I really wanted one when they came out, and now when I look back with 20, 30 years ago, I definitely don't miss that.
I wonder if they're on eBay now. There's a nice insight story that the reason they didn't sell as well as hoped is after having built and designed them without speaking to the consumers first. The insight was that consumers or people felt safer on a bicycle rather than in a plastic box next to the wheels of a lorry as it thundered by them. So
they do. When you look back, they are death traps. Surely, it's just, you've seen all those clips where where Clive's cycling or traveling alongside, and you just think this isn't going to end well.
It's not going to end well for anyone.
No. So then, being sucked into the delights of investment banking and regulation and all of that framework, you hopped into RBS eventually, yeah. And then how did that journey go into, because I loved your title, that emerging technology. How did that evolve?
So I spent my first decade of my career building UBS's financial ledger. So putting together all of their ledgers from all of their consolidated banks, the ones they've acquired, into a single ledger. We did that, and we're quite comfortable. The team that I work with was one of the best in the industry, and we say that because when the crash came and the volumes spiked, the system we built just didn't even miss a beat. No one got called. It did exactly what it would do, was designed to do, and it soaked up all of the trading volumes all the way through the crash. Doesn't matter which markets, equities, commodities, fixed income, and it made us very aware that no one was going to give us another dollar to invest in that system.
Right.
And given that the team was designed and built to improve this system, no one was ever going to give us a dollar again. So the majority of that team bomb burst across the city into different financial houses. RBS had spectacularly shown it couldn't add up, and had gone to the taxpayer for funding. And I got the call to go into RBS and be part of the team to rebuild their finance, risk, and treasury systems. And I had a cracking time moving RBS on their journey towards a single consolidated ledger. But once that journey had started, I didn't need to spend another decade watching RBS learn how to add up. We'd done the job we'd been asked to do, which is make sure they couldn't fail to add up again. And actually what came calling was we backed Ripple into the FX wholesale trading desk back in 2014, and realized that this concept of a digital asset, in that case Ripple, but Bitcoin was already on the rise, was a real innovator, a real innovation, a real disruption to the financial markets. And that's what pulled me out of the investment bank, which at the time was kind of collapsing like a dead star, into the emerging tech. And we covered, as a team, I brought some of the best engineers across from the investment bank, and we were able to cover retail, commercial, corporate, and over into the investment bank, and really spread our engineering and emerging tech skills across those areas of the bank, where the banking industry is always thought of as sort of one big homogenous things, but actually it's a very spread out and siloed affair.
How did you filter what would be in your emerging tech portfolio? What was in and what was out? Did you have sort of criteria, or was it? I'm just interested.
So it became we had to sit down and work that out. You can obviously download the Gartner hype curve, see what's coming up the hype curve, but we designed and developed a strategy which got us ahead of our vendors. The software vendors and the large vendors will always be at the cutting edge of those emerging techs. Otherwise, they will slowly die with their existing product set, and they will bring to a bank like RBS products, and the fintechs will do the same. They will take a new piece of emerging tech or a new idea, wrap it in software, and then try and sell it to the banks. And the purpose of the emerging tech team was to get ahead of those vendors and successfully unwrap the idea, the innovation, the actual IP, if you will, and make sure that we weren't being captured by a vendor, sold some sort of duff idea, and most importantly, be able to develop it ourselves internally so that we could actually not just be beholden to a vendor. And I think we were very successful at staying ahead of the curve, ahead of the vendors. I think the only one, and I always name them, was IBM, where IBM's, when you actually get under the skin of IBM, they carry three research, maybe even more now, three proper PhD research labs that are looking into things like quantum AI. They then also got Hersley, and they've got another site over in the US, which is actually doing product development.
Right.
Very hard to get it ahead of IBM. They've also got 50 years of corporate history of how to stay ahead of the industries that they are serving. And probably one of the remarkable things I learned in building that strategy and deploying it and running that emerging tech team was it's actually exceptionally hard to get ahead of IBM. In fact, assume you're not, and you're probably in a better position.
I mean, I'll come back to that innovation and evolution. How that works, because it's a regular conundrum. Some people do it well, some people do it very badly. But I'm just interested. RBS in its heyday was obviously a combination, as you said, of investment banking activity, but also retail. Thinking about Andy and I's conversation about evolving sort of wealth and asset management, how much of the technology or the the improvements do you think were directed towards investment banking or retail? Is retail a poor cousin of that kind of innovation? How do you think that works?
I grew up in the investment banks, so I'm obviously going to annoy someone in your audience when I say that the tech goes downhill and waterfalls, starts with the investment banks. Yes. And that's only because the money was there, the engineers were there, and actually we were absolutely pushing the forefront of the technology space in the late 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s, up until the crash. Anywhere that anything was new was in the investment banks. And then that would then sprinkle downhill into the corporate banking, commercial banking, and then onwards to retail, and then finally rolling around in asset management or insurance. And as I said, some of your audience would say that that's the wrong way around, and I think they're right. What we have then seen with the rise of mobile phones and then onto smartphones is actually an inversion of that, where consumer apps have started to drive the front end. And there's no doubt that what we saw post-crash was a huge disruption to the retail banking, with the likes of Tom over at Monzo, creating a brand new user experience. Over on the wealth management side, this month alone, you've just watched GameStop and the story around GameStop, where Robinhood is obviously a catalyst to that. The creation of that has been from Robinhood, and the new user experience around it. And we have on the subject of wealth management, people have started to gamify and acquire shares very much as they would do a retail banking app, and the merge of those two is obvious. But don't get me wrong, that disruption, as we tend to call it, is simply a lipstick on a pig. And Tom always hates me calling the Monzo pink card is lipstick on a pig. But then if you talk to Monzo's CTO, they're spending now a vast amount of time talking to the regulator, sitting in round tables with their peers, the other banks, trying to move the banking system, the back end of the banking system forward and evolve it, and realizing that the biggest blocker to the evolution, to Andy's desire of a new product, a new way, is the regulation that we have.
Richard, listening to your stories, I was thinking you had designed and developed systems and softwares and managed teams over the last, let's just say, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And I was making some notes here, and I think I'm right in my social history. And in that time, the consumer had seen big shifts in their relationship with where wealth was sitting, and it came closer to their hands. So I remember my father getting very excited when he put down the newspaper at the announcement that shares in British Telecom were going to be sold. And everybody took a day off and queued to get shares in British Telecom. And then they privatized the railways, and they started. So there was the big privatization stuff going on in the 80s. Then a new product came out called the ISA. That got everybody excited. And then there was the chip and pins, and then the banking apps latterly, and all in the context that interest rates used to be at 15% in the 80s, and now they're near to next to nothing that makes no odds. So there's this big shift of where wealth sits in the world, and it seems to be coming closer and closer to the hands of the person on the street. And as you just alluded to, I like the lipstick on a pig Monzo analogy, but there seems to be a lot of pigs out there and a lot of lipstick. So where does this keep going? Do you think that? So
my story has always been, as I said, you could hear from my background, I've been at the back of a bank dealing with the pig, dealing with the reporting to regulators, and how do you fix the back end? Because if you haven't fixed the back end pipes, you can't do any more trading. Most people are unaware that a lot of the investment bank trading desks were limited and are still limited in the number of trades they can do a day because of the back end pipes that are their finance, their risk, and their treasury. So people like myself who have been improving those pipes have always been dealing with the pig. It just wasn't fashionable. So we now move into an era when you recognize that Monzo can only get so far and can only do something different if the pig is changed. You can keep changing the color of the lipstick, but if we look at the digital asset, which is what made us leave RBS and stand up Lab 577, was the digital asset wave, the creation of virtual currencies, the Bitcoins, which were the innovating first instance of that, but are now turning into digital securities. To your question, Andy, absolutely, there's a social revolution going on that's been going on for 30, 40 years, where there is a widening of the net of investors who are gaining. But if you look at some of the people that are out there trying to attract even more people to buy shares, they're not out there trying to flog shares. They're simply trying to introduce people to the concept of owning wealth or wealth generation. And that actually, as a social experiment, needs to be done in the schools so that we have a generation of people coming through that understand it. But the driver here is technology and has always been. So if you look at what your father used to do, which was open the paper to see what the stock prices or share prices were, actually there's a generation that have now come out of school and are now in the workplace who are growing up who have literally no concept of that as a way of looking at what their share price would be. They have and from the 2000s onwards, the ability for the wealth managers to use the internet to supply their services. The idea that you now go onto a website to see what your portfolio or your stocks are, or even to buy and sell them, is obvious. It's just it's a given.
Yeah.
And then you take forward now 10 years and you're looking at the apps of things like Robinhood, where it's now just in your hand, sat on the sofa, don't even need to go to the web to do it.
Yeah.
For the new generation coming through, well, that's obvious too. I can buy shares literally on my sofa. But we've only done that over the last generation.
That's right. So you're describing the Robin Hoods and the eToros and the free trades. And at one end, they seem to be, I'm being descriptive, not brand management here, but they seem to be authoritative and deliberate and well managed at one end, and then there's some real cowboy kind of apps at the other, and people can lose a lot of their own money, can't they? So it's not the tech thing; it's this education thing. Is that the next leap?
This is always the way, which is we see a lot of fintechs coming into the finance space. A lot of people coming in, going, "Oh, there's a clear market here. There's a potential. There's people need this product, and we can deliver it. It's really easy to deliver it. We've got the tech now to deliver it." They then walk into that space, into that market. They see a huge target addressable market. They see huge potential for profit and value, and they grab that bit of the value chain. And many of them are not malicious. They pile into that space to serve the customers, only then to find that the the service that they're offering is a regulated one. And the cost of serving those customers in terms of fulfilling the regulatory duties as it's a regulated activity far exceeds the revenue that they're going to get. And they go bust very rapidly, or they back out because it's not profitable. And that area of the market remains a huge draw for people to come in. And I see it time and time again where people start up a payments app where they're going to move money for people, remittance from India to the US, or actually we're going to give people the sort of same faster payments, real-time payment system the UK enjoys. We're going to put it in the US. And look, we've done it. And everybody can move money around in the US, only for the feds to turn up and point them out that they're breaking the Wire Transfer Act and they have to be regulated. And in actual fact, here's an orange jumpsuit, you get to do 30 years in a federal penal. So the answer here is absolutely there are cowboys. There is always out there people who will want to take your money. And there is a large number of people who have little financial education who've accumulated a tremendous pot of wealth in their pension or savings that the government needs them to have to live on for the rest of their lives. And you've got to have a very impressive regulator that can stop the sharks and cowboys stealing it. They're just fraudsters, they're just thieves, but they might come in a suit, don't get me wrong, but they are still acting improperly. There is also a tremendous number of people in that space who are borderline criminal by charging huge fees, and over time the person with that pot doesn't realize, but their fees have been so what you've seen with the regulator, certainly in the wealth management space, is tremendous amount of regulation to protect the consumer investor. But of course, in doing so, the cost of serving that regulatory burden has to be passed on to the customer. And this is where this tangled balance comes in, where the regulator has actually only a very small number of tools in their toolbox. KYC is a really good example. It's a horrid and horrible regulation that gets dropped on each of the companies in the regulatory space, and they must conform to it. Otherwise, you're breaking the anti-terrorism, anti-money laundering rules. So the fines and the criminal things is huge. But all you're actually doing is passing around photocopies of people's passports. You don't know that that passport is valid. You don't even know that that person actually owns this passport. You've been asked by the regulator to take a photocopy of that passport. So here we are with a horrendous pain for the industry. Certainly in wealth management, KYC is probably the first and foremost problem or challenge in their mind. And I think that's a good example of where emerging tech, you've got to fix the back ends rather than try and get a better way of scanning someone's driving license.
It appeared they sort of take it in turns, don't they? That we've made a great leap in some consumer-led, insight-inspired ideas, and this has got a lot of attention. And now we need the back end of the pig, I like this analogy, to catch up with the snout. And that's all a bit dull and a bit not necessarily exciting, but it's necessary. And then a consumer step forward, and then another regulatory step. So there's this sort of rhythm that's ongoing. All interesting stuff, Chris.
And you're seeing that. You're seeing that, Andy. You know, the crypto space that has driven these virtual currencies, created wallets, has created totally new back-end pipes. If you look at the KYC problem in the wealth management space, actually we're trying to solve the wrong problem. Rather than have a better or faster horse in being able to photocopy passports, you look at something like the Corda network, where every entity or legal entity on there is a known entity. The asset managers and the brokers, if they piled into that network, would immediately know who each other are and wouldn't have to deal with the KYC anymore. So it's a really good example of where we're using an emerging tech, in this case blockchain, to actually solve a problem, not by chasing pieces of photocopied passport around, but actually say you can solve this from the top down, not from the passport in. You're also seeing the emergence of brand new exchanges. So the incumbents like the London Stock Exchange or NASDAQ are now seeing the emergence of ABE out in the US or Archax in the UK. Both are new exchanges creating new ways of looking. Look at something like Skyhook, what Lawrence is doing out in Asia. Again, what we're now doing is learning from that crypto space, bringing the innovations into the financial space, and actually re-plumbing the back end, which then allows you to have a much better customer experience at the front end.
And I mean, I find that fascinating, Richard. It's, you know, I think of the rising standards from the back. You know, you talked about regulation, or you talk about, you know, back end or the pig. It's facilitating that means you can rethink the business models at the front, doesn't it? It smooths the engagement at the front, you know, at the front of house, the consumer relationship or the institutional relationship. But actually, it's a slower journey, isn't it? Because you're having to, you know, none of the leaders in the market are going to throw out their legacy products, you know, or their legacy technology, especially if they're top of the tree. Why would they change? That's the problem, isn't it?
And if you look at the investment, the sheer amount of investment in what we would call public securities, both equity and debt, in the 90s and early 2000s, especially the ability to distribute that across the internet, that's what the wealth management and asset management firms are now using to deliver their current processes and systems. They've got things like Robinhood out there, but the reason that Robinhood is able to exist and provide free trades or zero commission trades is because actually the plumbing was improved in those markets. The market that we are interested in, the one we're focusing on, is in the private markets, so that being private securities, both debt and equity, where it's a much bigger, I mean, it dwarfs the public market. And actually, if you look at the rise of wealth in Asia, wanting access to a debt in London real estate or corporate bonds, that is what's coming next. And that's what the wealth management and your audience is looking for, is how do I bolt on private securities to my platform so that I can serve customers with a wider set of assets. And that's where the work that we're doing in digital assets keeps coming back to. We need to dematerialize the private securities, something we've done with the public securities for 30 years. We need to dematerialize private securities into digital assets. Some people call it tokenization. And those tokens can then be held by consumers or their brokers, probably their brokers, because they trust them more. And those brokers, those wealth managers, are now starting to wake up. Again, look at the work that Skyhook's doing out in Asia. The Asians are ahead of us in this regard. I would hope that from this call, I'd get somebody ringing me up to say, we're interested. We think this is the future. You never know.
Well, I mean, I always think it's fascinating, and Andy and I talk about this a lot, and I've indoctrinated him to remember that, the delights that you mentioned Robinhood, and on one hand, it's fascinating that you give people greater access to trade, with zero cost. My beef is that it encourages bad behavior, or it's like letting your teenagers smoke. It might seem cool at the time, but you might lose a lot of money in the long term, or it's incredibly unhealthy. So but what you're saying, in some senses, you've got to, that's that education piece, isn't it? You've got to, getting people on that journey is better than not. Now you've got to point them in the right direction. That please don't invest all of your income in stocks you don't know about. You need an investment strategy, then it's fine. Or a saving strategy. And it's interesting, about that education. So, I'm fascinated by that race and, how you manage that. So
let's talk about the social problems. We talk too much about the tech, but you're absolutely right, Chris. If we look at, once we have got people hooked on investing in wealth generation, in financial products, be it shares, debt, whatever, how do they make decisions about where it goes and how much they should put in? Those are all what should be taught at school. We all know that. It's all taught late and people find out about it later. But there is also a social issue here where if you put betting shops against share brokerages, and they always hate to be assumed, but the big difference here is your chance of winning a large amount in a betting shop is far greater, and the human psyche desires is happy to bet the whole sum for a huge prize, and they tend to, as perceived risk always shows us, always tend to reduce the actual probability of it and always focus on the impact, i.e. the prize in this case. And if you look at where the regulation requires the UK wealth management asset houses to only promise 7% annual return, when most of us that own shares look across our previous years and go, 7% is a bit conservative. I mean, there's years have gone by where it's made 30%.
Yes.
7% may be the long-term average, but that doesn't make any sense. But that is what the UK regulator, the FCA, requires of that industry, they are not allowed to state anything higher than 7%. So it's then really difficult to attract investors in when the human psyche needs 14 or 28% to actually make them bet a pound, or invest a pound, or put, to use the terminology, a pound at risk. So there is a social element to this, and you see it in the park when you sit at a bench every day. If you sit there with a pret-a-manger sandwich, I think for many of your audience, the days of going back to sit in the London.
How we dream of a Pret.
Just dream of a Pret
I
sandwich.
just want to sit there and have an overpriced bagel once again.
Why would you do this to me while I'm listening to my podcast? But when they watch the pigeons coming in, you'll find the pigeons are all different. They're not all the same. Some have an aggressive appetite for risk and will push the boundaries, getting closer and closer to your feet to take that one crumb that you've dropped from your sandwich, and others will hold back. The hungrier they get, the more appetite they have for risk. But you can see the same, absolutely the same market events going on as you've seen with GameStop, watching a flock of pigeons at your feet. And it is, as you rightly say, a social conversation as much as it is tech.
Yeah, and actually the size of the crumb is also important, because then at an animal level, the risk reward, so you have to keep your crumbs the same size. This doesn't make good podcast if you're listening to this, dear listener in Cheltenham, but my visual is this social journey seems to be that once upon a time, the consumer would say, my wealth is over there, and it's held in institutions or held with smart people that know more about me than numbers and my investments, my pension, etc., etc. But it seems that we are now on the cusp in 2020 of everybody says, now my wealth is here. And I'm not saying that it's all literally sitting on their smartphone, but the proximity of people's personal wealth in space and time is very much in their own hands. And it appears, Richard, you've got a bit of passion about the need to educate people into, well, now what? Because where I could hold other people to account if they lost my money or stood on my pigeon, now I'm the person that's to make the decisions here. And if without the educational confidence, things could stagnate. I could become very rich and very poor, but the onus is on me. Yeah.
Let's just focus on retail, because retail banking and retail transactions, you talked about chip and pin. The two examples I always explain to people is, you've all got a banking app on your phone now, most of you do. You open it up and it tells you how much money you've got in the bank. No, it doesn't. It tells you how much that bank owes you. That's all. But the concept is that everybody believes that is how much money they have at the bank. No, that's how much money the bank owes you. It's an IOU. So conceptually, we have created in society a belief that the money is in the bank, but actually it's not. It's what they owe you. So that first conceptual difference between you have a risk that bank might go under, and we put guards around it, which is why you find that people leave their money there. 75% of transactions in the UK, card transactions, are done with a debit card. But that's your cash. That's physically your cash. The loan or the money that was in the bank, you just gave to a retailer for the goods and services you bought. If there's any issue with that, i.e. you aren't able to fly because of a pandemic, or you wanted to return that, you've now actually got to get that money out of that retailer and back into your bank. And actually your bank's not going to help you. The retailer is massive, usually, so they've got bigger, hairier lawyers than you. So why did you do that? If you'd used a credit card, like the 25% of transactions, the consumer protection around that means that the money doesn't end up in that retailer's hands for about 90 days. And it is upon the credit card issuer to deal with the problem and to extract the money out of you at the end of the month and the rest of it. So for those of us who've kind of learned that commercial, the risk, everything I buy goes on a credit card. Everybody's like, oh, but we were taught not to use credit cards. That was to stop you going into debt. But actually, The bigger problem you've got right now is that your credit card gets used for fraudulent activity, or you've got a retailer you've got a dispute with where you've kind of given him the money and now you're asking the bully to give you the money back. Difficult situation. While with the credit card, you can look at the bully and go, it's not my problem. All I gave you was an OAU from the bigger bully. Off you go. And they can have a debate about it, where someone like Amex or Visa will absolutely beat up even an Amazon or even an Apple, who you want to give your product back to. So you're absolutely right, Andy. But there were some bigger, more fundamental things that we have right at the base of our financial system with our consumers that we need to solve first. I'm simply trying to solve, as we pointed out, the pig, and the pun gets back ready for it. But I do agree with you that people are starting to own their wealth. They're starting to understand it. They're having it in their fingertips.
Yeah.
There's a new generation of people coming through who absolutely
that fascinating relationship that we have with our own money, and you see all these pensioners sort of stacked outside Northern Trust, waiting to get their money as if they're going to be handed, right, there's your bag with your name on it, and it's actually physically yours. We've been keeping your money in this bank in the same way a book keeps a library. But that's the way, I guess, the psychology of the mind works. It needs things physically to grasp and sort around, and jars and pots, and it all happens in schools where we put money in jars in order to learn it. Maybe that metaphor carries through to our adulthood, and that's how our
counting beans is a much easier concept than assessing risk. If you look at the US economy and the way the US banking system works, it's all about gold bars and the money moving across the street. If you look at the euro and the euro project, that's all about risk. So they're actually supposed to settle every day. At the end of the day, the French and the Germans, the Spanish, Italians are actually supposed to settle how much they owe each other. They haven't done since 2008, and currently Spain and Italy have a huge debt to, funny enough, the Germans, and they're carrying it on as they move the Euro project onwards.
Countries in Europe haven't settled their differences for thousands of years, Richard. But
there's been a couple of attempts to solve the debt problems, but they don't end well. So anyway, you're absolutely right. These concepts are harder to grasp.
So I'm going to, there's two agenda points that I want to signpost. I think we're going to be running our quiz now. And then afterwards, I'm going to ask you, Richard, what are the big things that Lab 577 is working on?
Surely.
I'll be interested to see, we talk about the back end of the pig and all these ridiculous analogies, but it'd be really interesting to see some of your, even just some of the goals for 2021 or whatever you've got, however you're determining your progress. But I think it'd be good to run a quiz if you're up for this.
I'm up for this. This should be good. I don't think Andy is.
Oh, I'm ready to go. I've used so many different ways of strategies to solve things, and they've all not worked. So I'm going
to mostly to displace the quiz, so we don't get time to do it.
This time, I'm just going to say A for all the questions.
So I think I might have made an error in the sense that normally we have 5 multiple choice questions. I appear to, Andy, in my rush, I appear to have written 6.
Oh well, let's do it.
So if you can handle the stamina, we're going for it. You ready?
Yeah. Well, because 5 questions forces a winner, but 6 questions we could tie, Richard.
We could.
It's true. It's true, but I might have rigged it anyway. No. Let's carry on. Right. Question 1. Are you ready? So generally, what happens? We'll have I'll pick whoever answers first. I'll take a note, Richard, and then we'll just tally it up at the end. We'll go through each of them and then round up. So, question 1. Who is a famous alumni of Bristol University? Is it A? Of course, having gone there, Richard, all the alumni. That's exactly my logic. Is it A, Albert II, Prince of Monaco? Is it B, James Blunt? Is it C, Derren Brown? Or is it D, Lembit Opik, that former Lib Dem MP? I think, did he have something to do with the Cheeky Girls? So which of those was a former alumni? So just to try and make it fair, Andy, I'm going to ask Richard to go first.
Normally the question is who's famous from Bristol, and Brunel is always the answer. The alumni of University of Bristol. I'm going to go for James Blunt.
James Blunt, B. Andy?
I thought it was Darren Brown, but I think he's an Exeter lad because he used to come to our college in Plymouth and practice his wares as a student. And I think it might have been James Blunt as well.
Are you going to go James Blunt?
Yes.
Okie dokie. I will allow similarity for one.
We're allowed to say.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Yeah.
Question 2. Slightly more highbrow. According to Investopedia, no less, UBS Wealth Management is the largest wealth manager in the world. But how many assets does it manage in AUM terms? So is it 1.3 trillion, 2.6 trillion, 3.9 trillion, 5.2 trillion? And Andy, look, you're up for this, I can see. What's your answer?
Go big or go home. 3.9 trillion assets under management.
3.9. Richard?
Interesting. So I was always taught when we were doing our graduate training that the UBS Wealth Management, the private bank effectively of UBS, was second to the Japanese post office in asset management. Asset under management. The Japanese post office is always seen as maybe that's changed over the last 20 years. But there was also, and I don't think I'm letting go of any strategy because it's now 20 years ago, that they were attempting to get to 7% of the world's assets under management.
Really?
Was their target. So there's kind of gives you an idea of what they were trying to achieve in the turn of the century, so 2000. I'm going to go for, it's probably 3. I'm going to go for the 3.
3.9 as well. Yeah.
Yep. Let's go for that.
Isn't it? 7%. That seems a lot less concentrated than you might think. That you'd expect, the leading wealth provider to, other markets. I kind of have in my head that they'd be nearer 20s or something. I don't know.
90%. Nah, you've got Credit Suisse across the street trying to do the same thing. Remember?
Yeah. No, it's agreed. Question 3. This is who was blockchain invented by? Reportedly, supposedly, all of those wonderful words. Was it Toshiyuki Kuwabara, Satoshi Sakamoto, Satoshi Nakamoto, Uri Geller?
What was
Could be
Toshiyuki Kuwabara, Satoshi Sakamoto, Satoshi Nakamoto, Uri Geller.
Satoshi Nakamoto?
What do you say? You're saying
Satoshi Nakamoto.
Satoshi Nakamoto. That's a C. Andy, what are you going for?
But just for variety's sake, B. Satoshi Sakamoto.
B. Excellent.
I got that wrong.
I can sense you know that. Funny enough, you mentioned IBM, and there's an IBM question here. Just this week, IBM have announced a 100 times increase in its quantum computing capability, or that's their press release. How many
lights dimmed the other day?
How many qubits are planned for release in 2023 in its Condor system? Andy, do you want Richard to tell you what a qubit is?
I know how many bits there are in a byte, but I don't know how many qubits there are in the new Condor.
Well, the options are 27, 256, 1,121, or 2,400.
Sorry, so those numbers again.
27, 256, 1,121, 2,400.
This is to do with like super uber processing power and speed. Yeah. Today's lecture will be brought to you by the stand-in teacher called Andy. I'm drawn to 256. Can I answer this first?
Go for it. 256 is a good answer.
So let's be talking about this. So, Andy, this is very similar to Bell Labs created a transistor. Then they put a couple of transistors together. Then they worked out how to put 4, and we got integrated circuits and carried and carried. And now your phone's got billions of transistors in it. And I mean that literally 4 or 5 billion in each of the chips. And we're doing the same curve on this. So we were in the low teens, and I think IBM pushed it to 25. So if they've done it by 100 times, that's not 256. I think the larger number. What was the larger number?
The larger number is 2,400.
Interesting. So
and there was 1,021. Is this
1,121?
Moore's law and space?
Yeah, it's exactly. That's what Moore's law was following on the silicon chips. These are quantum chips. So it's going to be around 1,000. So give me those numbers again. Sorry.
No, it's fine. 27, 256, 1,121, or 2,400.
Well, if they've had 100 times increase, let's go for the 11, 20, 21.
Cool. Excellent. Number 5. Who said a computer would deserve to be called intelligent if it could deceive a human being into believing that it was human? Was it Tim Berners-Lee, Alan Turing, Elon Musk, or Alan Carr? Sorry, I shouldn't really be laughing at my own jokes.
Am I going first?
Yes, you go first, Richard.
Alan Turing.
Alan Turing. Andy?
Yeah, that's the Turing test.
That's the Turing test.
I'm very confident there.
Our listener in Cheltenham has just fallen off her chair.
Well, more importantly, it's followed very quickly by what's known as a mechanical Turk.
Yes. The mechanical Turk, yeah.
Wasn't it that was a man in a box playing chess?
That's effectively how you solve the Turing test by falsifying it, by putting a man or a lady inside the computer that's doing the test.
It was very clever. Last question, the last one. According to the Transport for Greater Manchester website, the 577 bus route starts and ends where exactly? I have to ask you why you're called what you're called in a moment, Richard. However, the 577 bus route starts and ends in, does it go from Bolton to Blackrod, Wigan to Norley Hall, Prestwich to Eccles, or Nirvana to the dark side of the moon?
Eccles?
I'm going for the last one.
Richard is throwing caution to the wind.
Just threw it out there, just see. What's the time, Eccles?
I'll throw that question.
Go on, Andy.
Well, I haven't had an A, so it's A, Bolton to where was the destination? End of the earth.
Blackrod. Are you ready for the answers?
Go for it.
Who is a famous alumni of Bristol University? Albert II, James Blunt, Darren Brown, and Lembit Opik. They are all alumni. You were both correct. Well done. Sue Lawley, I believe, is also an alumni. Susanna Reid, so my sources tell me. So Darren Brown, unfortunately, was also an alumni, but
was he? He's a Bristolian. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought he was Exeter.
UBS Wealth Management is the largest wealth manager in the world. Credit Suisse, this was at the end of 2020, have 1.3 trillion, which was the first number, and UBS is 2.6.
Oh,
oops.
For the others, you're unfortunately incorrect. Who was blockchain invented by? Toshiyuki Kuwabara was my pen pal in the 80s. And for some reason, I still remember his name. Good old Toshi. You were absolutely correct. The answer was Satoshi Nakamoto. C, Richard. Unfortunately, Andy, the spoonerism got you.
It was a slip of the tongue. Was that spoonerism?
Well,
that's a good job you didn't wish us fortitude and luck.
Yes, very clever. Well done. I'm not going to explain that one. Just this week, IBM announced 100%. So it was 27 is what they have now. So Richard, it's called Falcon. So you're pretty much spot on with your guess there. and they are increasing in 2023 to 1,121, which is called Condor.
I was always going to get that one wrong, listener.
Well, I like the way Richard thought it through, as opposed to other answerers. Anyway, moving on. Alan Turing obviously said a computer would deserve to be called intelligent. Well done. And going into the last question, Richard has 4 correct. Andy, you have unfortunately only 2. So Richard's calculations were he was confident enough. The transfer of Greater Manchester website, the 577 bus route, does in fact go from Bolton to Blackrod.
Get in the bag!
Well done, Andy. Unfortunately, you just lost out 4-3.
Oh, it's those pesky guys at IBM again. Who'd have thought it that the guys at IBM would have duped me on a quiz? Well done, Richard. What an excellent
Andy, thank you.
quiz buddy you were.
So fantastic. So thank you very much. Moving on to your laboratory, Richard. We've talked about, your heritage about building out the back end. Is that what you're continuing in your new venture? What's the big goals for Lab 577?
So I don't think we wear our heart on our sleeve. We're very much focused on the disruption caused by the innovation of digital assets. People being able to create their own virtual currencies, and we've been watching those for a while now. But the dematerialization of the private securities market, both equity and debt, into tokens or digital assets that can be moved around freely between brokers or between investors. That's definitely what we are focused on. You can see that from the work that we're doing. We've now provided digital asset shared ledger, our software product, into Skyhook, who are building a wealth management platform out in Asia, and they're pulling in partners on a regular basis. And they are very much focused on creating digital assets on the sell side, and then obviously bringing in partners on the buy side, the brokers and the wealth managers, to hold those. That gives those wealth managers access to new asset types, but more importantly, rid them of quite a lot of the inefficiencies of dealing with private securities, the paper and the workflows, and suddenly out of nowhere they can just hold it as an electronic object and move it around between brokers if investors move all things. And I think if you look over in the UK, much closer to home, you've got Archax and the digital exchange there, very much the darling of the fintech space, getting their license to be an MTF in the UK jurisdiction. Again, they are listing digital assets, and we're very much helping them. Go over to the US, and we've got Abe, who we just put a press release out to say that we are supplying their software to them to provide their digital asset solution in the back end of their exchange, as they again try and build a global exchange for these types of digital assets. And I think for your audience and your listeners in the wealth management and asset management space, we are well aware that it is difficult to deal with the regulation. We are expecting that regulation to change, and you are watching it change. Some ways it's positive, some ways it's negative. But the real initiative for us in 2021, if there's one space you want to look, it's very much in the digital assets. Those are disrupting the capital market space, and it is only a matter of time before they end up in your office and at your desk. And if you want to be a market leader in that space, then happy to take your call.
Well, I think it's fascinating. I was so there's another one of our prior guests has been looking at analysis of the asset owner and asset management space. And if you look at the largest, even the pension schemes, so that you would argue the sleepiest part of the industry, the largest schemes in the UK have the highest weighting in private assets. That's exact. So not only is there a push for the retail market for Bitcoin, etc. In that area, but the largest institutions in the UK and be mirrored elsewhere are looking for returns in private assets. So there's two tracks pointing at, and I'll ask the silly question, but private assets, what are you looking at? Is there anything off? What are people including in that category?
The private securities are driven down both equities and debt. Your audience are well versed on this. There's many better people to articulate this than me in terms of the thematics that are going on. We're not seeing the same number of IPOs. We're not taking private equities, private shares, and turning them into public shares. We're not listing them on public exchanges. And the exchanges well know that. They're drying up. Those private shares in private companies are growing at a phenomenal rate before they then list on the security. So if you're a pension fund, you're losing out on all of that value creation in the early starts of the thing. So there's no surprise that on the equity side, the pension funds are more interested in getting into these earlier. On the other side, on the debt side, there's a tremendous amount of high yielding assets, be it on the corporate's balance sheet, be it their offices, be it their inventory, the aviation industry, the transport industry as a whole, got ships and planes, containers, and the ability to actually offload those assets, securitize them, and then hold them as a yielding asset at much higher rates than you would get for cash, but with a solid backed asset that's backing that debt, is an attraction for the pension funds who can't get the kinds of yields they need from their normal government debt spaces. So they're looking for high yielding safe assets. UK real estate or UK office commercial property is a great example. And you've got a growing industry, a growing wealth base out in Asia who don't have pensions, and they are keen to acquire yielding assets. So those are the thematics you're seeing, and your listeners will know that from any of their briefings. They certainly don't need a software engineer to tell them that. What we're doing though is, as I said, we are re-engineering that pig. We are improving it so that they, as wealth asset managers, can acquire and get hold of those securities. We're dematerializing those private securities so they're easier to handle. And it's that's the journey we're on.
No, I love that. It's fascinating. I've got one or two final questions really, and Andy, please interrupt if you've got any yourself. But I'm keen, asking you a specific sort of wealth and asset management question. Are there things that you would either stop doing, you'd like to see in the industry stop doing, or would you sort of mandate some activities in the other direction? Is it you mentioned standards or regulation? Is that the sort of thing that you think would be really important to get right? What would you?
So I go back to regulation. It's not that I want to stop it. It's hundreds of years old. It's absolutely necessary to keep the trust in those established brokers. Don't get me wrong. The wealth management industry and the asset management industry are built on trust. Regulation is needed to keep that trust. But the centralization around a small number of large platforms will not help the industry. So the invention of the database and then the internet and the websites and the APIs has driven the asset managers and the wealth managers onto their equivalents of Facebook and Google, which has then given them this problem that they are over-centralized. And the regulation drives them to that. We're watching in Hong Kong, Singapore, and now Switzerland have just released their law, the decentralization, where the regulators are well aware that they've over-centralized. And I'd like your audience to keep pushing on their regulators to ask for decentralization to be a thematic or theme that they push as an industry on their regulator to make sure that they don't get trapped inside a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon, which is what's happening to their industry. In terms of mandatory, the rollout of the legal identity identifier will be well known. The LEIs will be well known to your audience, the wealth managers. It seems like a crippling and greater another piece of red tape that they have to go and engage with their clients and customers. But actually, it is the way to solve KYC in the industry. And actually, what you should be doing is having a conversation with the regulator, which stops pushing passports around the industry where we don't even know that that passport's valid. The only time we know that that passport's valid is when we put it on the barrier at Heathrow and the gate opens. And no one in the industry has access to that API. So you don't know that the passport you took a photo of is valid or not. Could be stolen, could be old. You know, it's just not necessary. But you want to have a conversation with the regulator to actually flip the KYC conversation away from photocopying passports and onto LEI, where the LEI is one of those fundamental building blocks that we've rolled out since '08. It's mandated since 2018. And if we can, by 2028, have rid this industry of KYC and rely on certificates with LEIs, we are going to be in a much better place for both client, investors, wealth managers, FIs, and the asset managers. So if there was one place I'd want them to go and fixate on, it's inverting the KYC conversation into LEIs.
No, I can wholeheartedly agree. And just in wrapping up, I've got one final question. But Andy, do you want to ask Richard?
We ought to speak some more, Richard. You seem quite passionate about the need for an element of education, not only in the industry itself, behind the scenes, you know, the pipes versus the lipstick, but also the people that ultimately affects, Mr. and Mrs. Miggins on the street. And to bring that education conversation sooner, maybe into the classrooms or maybe into the universities, because you, speaking personally, you tumble into the learning sometimes painfully or vicariously from listening to other people. But if there's no formal way of understanding,
be very cautious with that desire to go into the schools. For every person we send into the schools, they're either bringing an old message or they are and will be dwarfed by the number of people going to schools. There is quite a lot of people from the industry going in to teach at schools. But actually, the average age of a payments clerk in a financial institution is 55. They don't know what it's like to make a payment without SWIFT. They just physically don't remember. There's very few people left, but literally very few, that remember that payments could be made with a ticker tape. They don't have to be made with SWIFT. And the conversations we've had when we've gone into banks with a brand new payment rail or payment solution has always been, well, when do we send the message over SWIFT? So you've got to start in the industry. And if you look at the wealth management and asset management space, who are now on your audience chuckling away at their colleagues in transaction services or in payments, the handbook for collective investment schemes that the FCA has written has been created and curated for hundreds of years and is about to be upended.
Yes.
And needs to be upended, because the industry as a whole holds that up as some sort of Bible, but actually is watching others come up with new mechanisms for creating collective investment schemes. The DeFi space over in crypto is a good example. And to hold on to your collective investment scheme handbook will be very much you going down with your ship.
Yeah.
You as an industry need to take on innovative ideas. And sadly, the vast majority of the people at the top end of that industry aren't young and aren't able to pick up those new ideas. So in terms of teaching, Andy, it is actually how does an organization invert, this is back into Chris's space more likely, how does an organization, an FI, invert its teaching pyramid? So instead of the 55-year-old payments clerk brainwashing the brand new graduate, how does the graduate teach the payments clerk? So it's much more in your space, Chris, to actually look at the way corporate knowledge is passed on. Because the last thing we actually want to do is pass that corporate knowledge into the schools, where it's then just a vicious circle that goes round in circles.
Agreed. Richard, it's been fascinating. Do you have a who else should we interview? Who else should we have on this to continue the debate? Have you got a recommendation?
I would bring on Graham Rodford. Sorry, I don't get his name wrong. Graham Rodford over at Archax. He's the CEO there. He's another passionate. He's obviously passionate.